I should say microcopy is a term. Some people would say microcopy is all small UI text. I'm using, for the purposes of this presentation, it's easier to split it out. So if something's explaining something to your user, I'm going to cover that under embedded help. I really love this set of images from a signal versus noise blog. It shows that text is often what makes a UI meaningful, and you'd be surprised how much text there actually is in your software once you sit back and look at it. And microcopy is really hard, partially because, as every programmer knows, naming things is hard. So pinning down exactly what something does, how it works, and what you're going to use it for, and phrasing that concisely, that's just a difficult problem. And I'm afraid if you're a developer and you've spent ages naming everything in your code base really well, then I've got bad news for you, because you probably shouldn't be using those names in your UI. Let me show you why. So this is Cascade. It's a piece of HR software you will use at work. It is not a great user interface. And one of the reasons that it's bad, I want to draw your attention to here. It exposes internal system concepts to the user. So Cascade stores everything as records. So I have a holiday record, which I'll talk about here, but also you have an address record, a bank record, everything's stored like that. On this holiday page, I might come here, say it's a pretty common workflow. I'll come and look and see how much holiday I've got left, and then I want to book a holiday with what's remaining. What I'm looking for is a button that says book a holiday. And what it's given me is request a new record. There's a mismatch here. So for Cascade, that is correct. Internally, when I click on that button, that's what's going to happen. But that's not going to happen for me as a user, and that's not what I wanted to do. Similarly, this is an email it sends out once you've requested your holiday and your line manager's got back to you to say whether or not you can go. It sends you this huge email, which is completely useless for a number of reasons. So it says here, this was a request to insert an absence holiday vacation record. No, it wasn't. This was me asking to book a holiday. And that's not, this is a total mismatch between what I wanted and what the system wants. It has this category here, can you guys see that? Accepted, rejected. For the user, what they care about, accepted, rejected, they want to know whether or not they get to go on holiday. And what this is, it's the internal system category for the time my manager made that decision, which is completely useless information to me. By the way, this entire email, nowhere in the email body does it tell you whether or not you get to have your holiday. The only place it says it is right at the end of the title. So let's talk about ways not to do this. I've got 3 strategies I want to go through that can help us do better. And firstly is thinking from the user's perspective, choosing names they can understand, and experimenting with phrasing. So, that Cascade example brings us to the first point, which is to not do this. Think from your user's perspective. You need to put yourself in their shoes. Think about what the workflow there is that it is that they're doing, what tasks they're trying to achieve. And if you can just pin that down, then great, call it that. One of the things that was said yesterday was talking about how it's so easy to be product-centric, and this is kind of what I want to say. That especially if you're a developer, you spend your time thinking about how your software works because that's what your job is. But actually what you need to be thinking about is not how it works, but what it does for someone. Here's an example. This is Google Drive, and it's going from bad to good. They started out with this category, which was incoming, which looked suspiciously to me like an internal system category that's been leaked out. And they said, Google actually said people didn't get this and they didn't understand what it was for. And so they changed it to shared with me. And the reason that's better is because it tells your user what the category is going to do for them. So think about your user tasks, think about what actions they're doing. If you're writing button text, then actions are particularly good. So instead of like this, instead of thinking about what the button is doing internally, think what task your user is trying to achieve by clicking on it. So that first strategy gives us kind of the angle that we want to approach microcopy from. Next is thinking about terminology. So these are questions you can use to work out what you should call stuff. What's it normally called? What do your users call it? And what is it they'll understand? What it's normally called can be really useful. So my company do a lot of work in the Microsoft SQL Server space, where there's a lot of existing terminology, and we can use that to our advantage. This piece of UI is the connection dialog from SQL Server Management Studio. And the important thing about it is that most of our users see this every single day. And we can rely on their familiarity with this terminology to pick names that we know they'll understand. So when we're writing a connection dialog in our software, we mirror their terminology exactly, because we know that if we call it the same thing, then they'll understand what we're saying. Here's another example from Chrome. This is the Chrome settings for what you want to do on startup. And I really like this phrasing they've used here, continue where you left off. So they could have called it resume previous session or something that would have been accurate. But instead what they've done is they've phrased it in a way that users might speak. You can kind of imagine, a user researcher talking and saying, what is it you want Chrome to do when it starts up? And them saying, I just wanted to continue where I left off. How do you find out what your users call things, how they would speak? Ideally, talk to them, ask them. Obviously, you don't want to use leading questions, but trying to get them to talk through the tasks that they're doing with their software. Then that's a way you can get to their terminology. If you can't or don't have the time to run user sessions, there are other resources you can use. So looking at, you want to find places that they're talking about these tasks not influenced by your software. So support forums can be useful, but actually if it's something that people blog about, it can be really useful to read people's blogs and see how they talk about stuff and what words they use. So we've got some ideas of the angle we want to approach it from and the terminology we want to use. And now we come to phrasing. And the thing about microcopy is it's micro. It does have to be short, and that is difficult. So you can experiment with phrasing to try and get closer to something shorter. So one strategy I like to use to start with is trying to explain something in a sentence. Don't worry about the length, just try and get the sense right. And this is really useful, firstly because it pins down what you're trying to communicate, what you actually want to say, and gives you a basis to start whittling stuff down. But also because when you're writing microcopy, don't forget that you're a human speaking to another human just with a piece of software in the way. You don't need to write robotically, and by even saying it out loud, you often will come up with something that sounds much better and is much easier to understand. Oh, and one more thing is, then when you're playing around with this phrasing, don't forget you can do something a bit different. So if you're describing an option, it doesn't have to be noun that describes this feature. Here's an example from a piece of software that I've worked on. This is something we worked on, and it had this option that was you could link to your own repository or you could link to an evaluation repository. So this option was called evaluation repository. And that was accurate, that was what this option did. But it didn't very clearly express why you would want to use it. And so changing this phrasing around to just let me try it out gives a much clearer idea of why you'd want to choose this and what it will do for you. So finally, microcopy has to be short, and some things are just complex. There will be more information. You won't be able to fit it all in a short space. So this is where embedded help comes in. I'm sure lots of you are familiar with GitHub. This is a bit of their notifications UI. I just want to talk about this one option. They've named it well. They've got a nice, short, clear name. But what they've done is they've recognized, firstly, that new people might not know what watching means. And also, even people who do know what watching means might not know when automatically applies. So by adding this extra sentence to give some more context and explain what's going on, you make it much easier for users to understand what's happening. So that's one example of embedded help. I'm just going to show you a few others to give you an idea of what I'm talking about. So embedded help can include hover text, this kind of inline help I was talking about that is just text, placeholder text, and help widgets and pop-ups, and tools belong here as well. So I want to talk about what goes in embedded help, where the documentation comes in, where it is that you should put help, and a few ideas for ways of presenting it as well, the style. I said in my abstract that documentation is a last resort, and you could argue exactly the same thing about embedded help. That really what you should be doing is fixing all your usability problems as high up the chain as possible. Fix them in the design, fix them in the workflow, fix them in the naming. In a perfect world, you design a perfectly intuitive interface, but I don't think that's actually possible. But also, you won't always have the time or the resources to make the usability changes you want. The great thing about text is that it is cheap to put in, and if you can't fix something any other way, sometimes you'll be able to add a string that makes things a bit better. So let's start with what goes in embedded help, and I think it's effectively the answer to this question. What does your user need to know to complete their task? You have to find out what information would be blocking them and put that in the user interface. Here's an example from something that I've worked on where I got it wrong the first time. So with this option, Windows authentication, if you choose it, it's complicated. You have to go outside our software, and there's a bunch of stuff you have to do to make it work. So I thought, okay, right, I'll put a summary for the instructions for what people need to do, and power users will just be able to go off and do that. And for everyone else, I'll say, look, there are some full instructions, they're in the documentation, go and read them. And this didn't work. We got a bunch of support emails through from people who were baffled, they had no idea what they were supposed to be doing, and this didn't help them. So I went back and I tried something different, and what I tried was this. These are pretty much the full instructions from the documentation for how you set this option up. And the reason I put it there was I realized that I couldn't really justify hiding the information that users needed to get this working away somewhere that wasn't the user interface. And this was much better, and we basically haven't had support emails about it since. It's a lot of information, but actually, because it's structured as instructions, it's easier to read and to follow than the previous one, which came across as a little bit of a wall of text. So think about what your users need to know to complete their task. There is another side to that, which is don't include unnecessary information. This is a page with a whole load of help widgets on it, and just because you're putting help in one place doesn't mean you need it everywhere. There are some things that just don't need explaining. Yeah. Similarly, placeholder text, I think, is really useful for giving an example of a format of what you want to put in the field. This is completely useless. This doesn't help anyone. Next thing, it's really about this balance about what to put in. It's really important not to overload people. This was a support email we got in about, I mentioned earlier, I added some explanations on to the end of error messages. And the problem was it's too long. This guy, I've underlined the error message he sent us back, which has the solution he needs and which fixed it for him. But because there was too much text, he just didn't see it. And you have to remember that the more text you put in your UI, the less likely people are to even see it. They'll just skim past it. So there's a balance. And I think this is kind of what I use as a rule of thumb. If information is necessary, then there's a strong case for keeping it in the UI. And when I say necessary, I mean if most people will need it to solve their problems, or if new users will need it. So don't forget, all of your users are new users at some point. And if they don't understand it the first time, they maybe never will. But you have to be sensible and you have to balance it. If there's a lot of information, then what is an effective pattern is giving a summary, giving a little bit of an idea, and then linking to documentation for more information. This balance is really difficult, and you can make an educated guess the first time, but honestly, the only real way to get it right is to do user testing. Get someone to run through the task that you've put in the help for, get them to talk out loud, to think out loud, and see whether they understand it, see what they're struggling with. But I don't always have the resources to do user testing on everything, much as I would like to. And an alternative channel is support. the best resource I've had in the past year for understanding our users and what they struggle with has been being on the support rotor, and it's honestly helped me fix so much stuff in our user interfaces. So be on support if you can, but really talk to support because they know so much better than you what your users are having problems with. Next, I'm going to talk about where you put embedded help, and it's really important that you put it in the right place at the point of need. How many of you guys have gone to a website and been faced with a tool that's kind of covered up everything? And how many of you clicked out of that the first time you saw it? If you put help where people aren't looking for it, they will be annoyed by it and they won't read it. So this is a screenshot from Skype for Skype for Business. When you first open it up, you get given a 7-point introduction to a bunch of its features. This feature it's talking about here is actually really useful. I might want to know how to present while I'm on a Skype call, but this isn't in context. I might not even have seen this UI before, and when I get there, I'm not going to remember what this icon was. Let's see how to do it better. This is a screenshot from Inbox by Gmail, and what they do is when you're using it for the first time, you open an email, you click away to close it, it comes up with this, and it's a feature of keeping track of emails that you might want to, that you care about. So the reason that's good is because they're showing you the thing that's relevant to you at that point in the workflow. They're showing you this help when you might care about it. It's hard to see here because of the contrast, but this is just an overlay over the UI. You can still see the full context of where you are and how you'll find this feature again. Moving away from tools, this is an example I think is really great. I'm sure lots of you use Slack, and they have really good help for searching. So when you start typing in a search modifier, this information comes up, and it is all the different modifiers you can use. This is a lot of information, even for an experienced user to remember exactly how to phrase these things. And it's showing them to you exactly at the point of need. It's showing when you're searching, this is exactly when you'll care about this. It's also nice because it's unobtrusive. So if you already know what you're doing and you just start typing away, this immediately gets covered by the search results, so it's not going to get in your way. So I've shown you a bunch of different ways you can present embedded help, and honestly there's no point trying to cover everything because there are just infinite ways you could show it. But if you think that your application could do with some help and you're not quite sure how to present that, let me give you 2 suggestions for styles I think are good. Firstly, this kind of inline help, which is if you can get the explanation you want down to a brief sentence and you think that it's almost always going to be relevant, just leave it. Just put a string in, slightly grey it out so it's less obtrusive, but just leave it there all the time. And the great thing about this is it's really cheap on developer effort to put in. So you might be able to do that when you can't do anything else. If you've got more information, I really like this style of having an expandable question. So you have a link here, so the colour's gone a bit. You have a link here, and then you click on that to expand out the full information. And that's really good because it doesn't clutter up your UI with information that won't be relevant to everyone, but it also means you can anticipate what the help your users need. And if you can work out what question will be on their mind that they can answer, then they're much more likely to click through and engage with this and actually read what you've written for them. I also wanted to briefly mention hover text because it can be really useful, but you have to be really careful with it because it's not very discoverable, and obviously it doesn't work on mobile. In this situation, when you have a kind of baffling icon, I think it's really important to have hover text because you need some explanation of what on earth it is. But actually, maybe they just should have put some more text rather than icon to make it clear what this was supposed to do. But yeah, there are loads of different ways to do this. And if you have the resources to do something really clever and useful, go ahead and experiment, do something really great. But don't forget the basics. So make sure you found out what information your user needs to complete their task. Make sure you're not overloading them with information and linking out to the docs where you need it. And also make sure you're showing that help in a time and a place that is relevant to them, so they'll actually take it in. So finally we come to error messages. Error messages are my favorite because they're often so hilariously bad, but I also think of all of these kinds of writing, they are the easiest. They're the most satisfying because it's easier to get them right. And I think there's basically a formula for what you need to put into a good error message. So you need to talk about what went wrong, what the consequences of that are, and how your user can fix it. Let's start with what went wrong. And when I say what went wrong, I mean what went wrong for them. You have to say what is relevant to your user that has happened. So this is an example that I think is bad, and I think it's bad for two reasons. So firstly, you can see you've got a label in the UI. The error message doesn't match up to that label that your user sees. And the divergence is quite small here, but the bigger it is, the harder it's going to be for them to work out what's gone wrong. Secondly, cannot be null or empty. That's not a user category, that's a development category. What that means is, you can't leave that field blank. But what you've told them is presumably what function has thrown an error. Phrase it in a way that is relevant to your user, that tells them what they need, what has gone wrong for them. And then, I don't know how good the contrast is, I like these two examples better. Can't send photo, can't load search results. Those are nice and clear and concise, and they clearly express what has happened that has gone wrong. It's okay to be vague sometimes. This is a vague error message. It doesn't give you much detail, but that's fine. And I think there are two main situations it's good to be vague. One is if you don't know what's gone wrong. Sometimes you won't be able to say what's happened and exactly what's going on. So it's fine to say that something is wrong and you're not sure what. It's also, I would encourage you to be vague if you know exactly what's gone wrong. If you know exactly which bit of the code has thrown an error, that's often, your user won't care about that. In this case, when Twitter's down, it doesn't actually matter to me the reason I can't access it. The major thing that's important is that I can't get there. So next, the consequences of the error. This often won't be relevant, but if your user, for example, if you've lost data, then you need to communicate that to them. And you need to, again, communicate it in a way they can understand. This is a dialogue that Chrome throws up that I think is baffling. Returning to that page might cause any action you took to be repeated. Do you want to continue? I'm not sure. And if you phrase things this obscurely, it makes it really hard for your users to make decisions about what they're supposed to do. This is better. It's not an error message, but it makes it really clear what the consequences of something that you have to care about are. Finally, and most importantly, you want to tell your user how they can recover from this thing that's gone wrong. This is an example from Slack that I think has problems, and the reason that I think it's problematic is because it's hidden away what you can do to solve the problem. That paragraph is like 30-something words, and the solution is 4. Try restarting your browser. Don't hide away what your user needs to do to get out of this situation, the situation they've got into. I think this is much better. This is another Google Drive error, and it doesn't give you that much detail, but there's not much you can do to come back from this apart from give it another go. But actually, that's all you need to do. And as long as you give people the thing they need to do to recover, then that's what's important. One last thing, if you can be specific about what someone needs to do to get out of, to fix the problem, then be really clear. So here it says exactly which piece of the UI they need to use to try to recover. Similarly, if you have if you can even give them an action to do that's a button, a retry, that's great. So yeah, that is basically error messages. Tell your user what went wrong, the consequences of the error, how to fix it. Tell them in language that is relevant to them. And if these things don't apply, then leave it out. Oh, the other thing, but I forgot to mention how to fix it. If there's not a fix and it doesn't really matter, then it's okay. If it's like a trivial error message, it's okay to leave that bit out as well. So yeah, that's pretty much everything. In summary, to write well for user interfaces, Try experimenting with naming to get your microcopy right. Support your users with embedded help in the UI, but use the documentation as well. And use the formula for error messages. Please go home and just write better error messages. That would be, I would love it if you did that. One last thing, please send me your examples of good and bad writing for user interfaces. I blog about this on Tumblr. I would love to have more examples to write up. So yeah, tweet me, email me. I would love to see that. Thank you so much for listening. If you have questions or opinions, I'll be down here. Come and chat to me.
Thank you, Beth. Now it's coffee time. And snacks. There'll be snacks too. So 20 minutes.